The majority of academic psychologists, cognitive neuroscientists, and philosophers consider, implicitly or otherwise, that consciousness is synonymous with the ongoing experience of the ego. Everything outside of our immediate awareness, for people who subscribe to such a view, is completely lacking in any kind of consciousness whatsoever. Let us state this now. This is completely wrong. The affective neuroscientists and neuropsychoanalysts champion an alternative which they've demonstrated beyond any doubt, that affect is its own distinct form of consciousness, which is always a priori to any cognition going on inside the ego. A superb reference for this is the 2013 paper by Professor Mark Solms called The Conscious Id. In brief, affect arises from circuits originating in the oldest areas of the brain, specifically the brain stem and the midbrain, and is conscious, in an experiential sense, unto itself. This surges forwards to the cerebral hemispheres, where cognition is brought into ego-conscious awareness by the affect. Indeed, most strikingly, in some cases of hydrancephaly, that is, people born without the cerebral hemispheres, consciousness, in the very recognisable human sense, is still absolutely present. It just isn't cognitive, it's affective. Affect consciousness is thus phylogenetically and ontologically a priori to cognition. Steve and Pauline Richards have observed the same dynamic, empirically, since the 1980s, and are in full agreement with the neuropsychoanalysts that consciousness extends beyond the ego. However, in psychosystems analysis, consciousness does not bottom out in affect. It goes much, much further. We stated earlier that the ego has four qualia of consciousness: somatic representation, sensation, affect, and cognition. These follow a neat phylogenetic or evolutionary progression in terms of when they first arose across the tree of life. We'll take an example to show this in action, to demonstrate this fundamental frame shift away from collapse into cognitive, or otherwise just ego, reductionism. The very earliest forms of recognised life, single-celled prokaryotes, which exist today as the bacteria and the archaea, certainly have a form of sensory and somatic consciousness. So, interoception and exteroception in the form of dynamic modelling of intracellular and extracellular states, given their existence as self-organising systems. They are not aware of what they're doing when they meet their homeostatic needs, but awareness in the ego sense is not, and should not be, the baseline definition of consciousness. That, rather obviously, evolved later out of a pre-existing substrate of more fundamental so-called consciousness. Single-cell prokaryotes have a rudimentary form of instinct too. Their simple gene regulatory networks are sufficient unto themselves to give rise to what some might call behaviour. Many can seek specific targets based on chemotaxis. They can travel from one place to another with their flagella, if they have one, and they can communicate with each other via quorum sensing. They are as conscious can be. After all, they are the dominant kingdom of life on the planet, albeit they do not have an ego. We need to and should put our own egos aside when trying to model something so fundamentally different to our ongoing everyday experience. Doing that allows us to see our own consciousness in a much more ancient evolutionary form. Indeed, it allows us to see that consciousness thus must be present within the dynamics of matter itself. The ego arises out from a much deeper structure, down into the conscious biochemistry and into the physics which determines the action of everything in existence. But is matter, with its seemingly innate properties, like charge, mass and spin, which beg for ontological explanation, as deep as we can go? No, we can go further. Metaphorically beneath matter, as its fundamental substrate, is information. Thus, in psychosystems analysis, the baseline state of reality is informational monism. Informational monism is ontologically projected into superposition with the material universe at the resolution of the Planck scale, the smallest dimension of space-time geometry. Here, it forms the fundamental field of information, which Steve and Pauline Richards have termed the platonic field. The platonic field is the ontological, organising and informing field of superpositioning information, out from which everything in the material universe arises. This includes the well-described fields of quantum field theory, synonymous with the elementary particles of matter, as well as the formative causation-carrying Sheldrakean fields, observed by Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. However, even naming these as their own discrete entities, whether that be an electron or a morphic field, is not something we should move into too hastily. Information certainly becomes matter, but it also remains immanent with it. For understanding consciousness, this is the crucial point. Information is always immanent with everything it superpositions into, and, just like the ego, it has its own qualia of consciousness. Thus, out from the platonic field, a priori to any specific collapse that we are familiar with in our daily lives, is superpositioned the objective waveform of information. The superpositioning of information across the objective waveform defines how the same information is represented at various levels of collapsed analysis, description, and explanation. An example will make this clear. Steve writes, quote, "An example is a complex that has representation at several different biopsychosocial systems levels. Each such systems level both represents and defines the complex within level. This means that the information that makes up the essence in itself of the complex is determined by the system level that represents it. For example, a somatic symptom profile of a complex both expresses and determines how the informational content of the complex is revealed. That same complex may also be represented psychologically or psychosocially, according to the properties and bandwidth of those classifications of systems. So, the objective waveform is synonymous with all superpositioning information, representing everything, all matter and fields in the universe. This objective waveform is conscious. In fact, it possesses the ground state level of consciousness, metaphorically beneath, but really immanent with, the other forms we've spoken about thus far, superpositioning itself through matter and across the tree of life, eventually into the four qualia of ego consciousness. Its qualia of consciousness, Steve and Pauline have called intuition. Or, more specifically, intuition is the experience that the ego can have of this ground state consciousness. Carl Jung originally defined intuition as perception by way of the unconscious. Given everything that we've discussed so far from psychosystems analysis, we can see that intuition, as a development on from Jung by Steve and Pauline, is really perception by way of the objective waveform of information. Intuition is thus the ground state level of consciousness, so incredibly ancient and yet timeless that it cannot represent itself directly within the evolved architecture of the ego. After all, the ego's experience is defined by cognition, affect, sensation, and somatic representation. These all evolved for a specific purpose, through Darwinian dynamics. A genuinely overt perception of the objective waveform itself on an ongoing basis would be cripplingly disorientating and maladaptive. Instead, intuition superpositions itself readily with all of the ego's qualia of consciousness, being capable of collapsing into any and all of them within our reflexive awareness. The ego, like everything else in the universe, is thus really a representation of the informational dynamics underpinning it. This, for the ego, Steve and Pauline have called the subjective waveform of information. Whenever informational superpositioning collapses into the ego, This defines the subjective waveform. All four of the ego's qualia of consciousness are always only collapsed representations of the much more fundamental intuition. If we consider the schema on screen, we can see this in action. The platonic field on the left-hand side is the ontological origin of the objective waveform of information, shown at the bottom. This collapses via intuition into all of the resolutions of psychobiology that we discussed earlier: the genome, instinct, the drive state, meta-instinct, and of course, the ego's subjective waveform. Intuition is thus capable of directly interfacing with all of them. This includes, of course, the genome's own meta-regulation, for example, its circadian and ultradian rhythms, and its whole of life timed release anticipations and meta-instincts. Therefore, too, intuition is the true initiator of the drive state, through field-resonant correspondence with the genome. The key element to remember in bridging this gap between biology and field dynamics is the very simple axiom that information, with its own ground state qualia of consciousness, is immanent, that is, superpositioned with biology. The genome is both material and it is informational. Anxiety is fundamentally a drive state originating from instinct, which in turn carries forward the intentionality of the genome. The drive state represents itself within the ego in various forms, indicative of the various collapsed diagnoses of anxiety. We can see now that every single step of this ontology is always in field dynamic relationship with the objective waveform of information that it is superpositioned out from. Instinct is innately conserved phylogenetic information, held within the genome and its fields, that represents, anticipates, and responds to resonant states and changes within the full objective waveform of information, the subjective waveform of the individual, and all of their associated biopsychosocial representations. Instinct may thus be initiated by a field intuitive consciousness, and it follows, so too can its resultant drive. Case in point, anxiety is pressure from the very field itself for the individual to actualize themselves in alignment with the telic intentionality of their genome and the teleology of the platonic field.